Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Greetings and welcome to the China Desk Podcast, hosted by Federal Newswire. I'm Steve Yates, chair of the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute and convener of today's conversation on all things China and China policy. I am honored and have the pleasure of Ben Weingarten joining the conversation today. Ben is deputy editor of RealClearInvestigations, a senior contributor to the Federalist, a columnist at Newsweek and the Epoch Times, and a fellow at the Claremont Institute. He is a 2019 recipient of the TFAS Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship, under which he covered the Trump administration policy, which we just may talk a little bit about today. Ben has written for The American Mind, City Journal, The New York Post, and numerous other publications, and co-hosts the Edmund Burke Foundation's NatCon Squad podcast. So for those into podcasts, take a peek over there too. But Ben, thank you very much for taking some time to join today's conversation. You and I have been able to engage in friendly banter about China a time or two over the years, and I've been an admirer of your musings and columns on the subject. We need more people jumping into the China policy conversation. And I don't know why it is, but it seems like either recovered journalists or commentators seem to be some of the best writers and thinkers on China policy, not those that come up through the government and academia. Go figure. But with that, Ben, why don't we start with the project that you were involved in that was looking at the Trump administration's policy towards China. As we talk about it, I welcome any insights that you want to share about how you came to take a bite of this apple. From what I know of you, but you could have fooled me all along. You didn't come up through the university program saying, I'm going to speak Mandarin and study China policy, government, et cetera, et cetera. But you certainly have jumped into the fray on the analysis and commentary of policy, as I say, in a way that looks constructive to me. What made you interested in the Trump administration's approach to China policy? And in your initial work and thinking about it, what did you think you were going to accomplish, and maybe what surprised you along the way in that project?
Well, Steve, first of all, there's mutual admiration here, and thanks for having me and for launching this vital podcast. First, a bit on kind of my non-traditional path, I guess, into this space. I grew up in a political household. My father was a local elected official and then a state legislator in New Jersey, ran for the House a lifetime ago, and lost in a brutal three-way or four-way Republican primary. But I was immersed in this from the start, and national security and
primary part hits close to home for me, just saying.
Yeah. And interestingly, some of the folks who were in that primary have emerged successful in other roles, even in recent elections. So, politics has an interesting way of having these recurring themes and personalities and the like. But national security and foreign policy was always a focus in my household, something near and dear, because obviously, if you are not the strongest power, if you are not a power that can operate freely in the world, as we of Americans have enjoyed for the better part of the last century, you're not going to be free. You will not be independent, and we won't be able to enjoy the blessings of liberty and justice that have been passed down to us, and which I think we've done a poor job over the last generation plus of maintaining, at least. So I was always interested in national security and foreign policy, wrote a bit about it, largely with a focus on the Middle East during my college days, and then subsequently went into the world of finance. I was an economics and political science major at Columbia, but continued as kind of an autodidact to focus on all things foreign affairs and studied as well a little bit of East Asian affairs while I was at Columbia, Japanese politics and the like, and a bit about the various civilizations as well, and continued that study as I went out into the world. Worked in finance for several years, but couldn't kick the bug for engaging in intellectual discourse. Before I got the whole golden handcuffs of investment banking, decided to jump out and to pursue a passion, because I frankly loathed and was aghast at the direction the country was going, and felt in good conscience I couldn't keep silent about it and put my head down and just try to make a a living, that there were more important skills and capabilities that I could bring to the table and more important focuses of my time and interest. And so jumped into the world of conservative media broadly, focusing again largely on the Middle East, but also as I began to really dig deeper into who was behind the greatest threats in the world, what was the size, scope, and nature of these various threats. And I should also jump back to noting that even from the time I was a kid, I was fascinated by the Cold War and studying the tactics of the Soviet Union and how we combated the Soviet Union. Obviously, there was another partner there who we effectuated some form of a Sino-Soviet split, however genuine it may have been. But there was another partner there, and another partner that continued to lurk and grew by leaps and bounds in a whole variety of metrics, economically, militarily, and in the ways in which it could flex its muscle. And what I came to see over time was that China not only was a hostile power, but unlike during the depths of the Cold War, it had compromised us and essentially infiltrated and embedded itself in our society to the nth degree, and essentially compromising every single influential power center in our country, each power center of which incidentally also happens to be now largely captured by the woke. And consequently, I think that's how you get to a scenario where within weeks of the Biden administration announcing that it was going to do away with the preeminent counterintelligence program, the China Initiative, at the very same time, it was opening up a new center to combat, or new unit to combat so-called domestic violent extremism with a particular focus on wrong thinkers. So that's a long-winded way of getting to the fact that I was always interested in defending America and its national interests, studying our history and the foes we faced and how we combated them. Obviously, growing up, the Middle East was a huge focus, in no small part because we were struck on 9/11, and I grew up about 40 minutes from Lower Manhattan and knew folks who had family members there. My father, in fact, was at the New York Stock Exchange that day across the street. And so you couldn't not be focused on national security and foreign policy, I think, growing up exposed to that. But obviously, China has become, and has for a long time, frankly, been the preeminent threat with, I think, not only the resources and the capability, but the will to be the dominant world power. And when we look at, quote unquote, composite strength of powers, I think will oftentimes can overcome capability. And it's my biggest fear, and what I've been writing about really since that project on the Trump administration's policy, because I predicted that the Biden administration would, at very best maintain some of the most politically popular aspects of that policy, but largely soften in a whole slew of other areas, is we will never get to combating the comprehensive nature of the China challenge if we don't get our own house in order here, and particularly if our own ruling elites essentially ape the tactics and strategies of the Chinese Communist Party to retain and expand their power here, while also being compromised and essentially paving the way for a dominant communist China. So that's a long-winded way of covering some aspects of what you wanted to address, and happy to jump in on the Robert Novak journalism project as well.
Yeah, well, a lot to unpack in that, and all good, because a lot of times in these conversations, try to get at what brings someone to the subject matter, what are sort of the building blocks of how they think about and assess China and China policy. You hit on a few of the things that are resonant with what our China policy initiative is at the America First Policy Institute, where it begins with the premise that there was this half a century plus bet that was made on engagement. It was very, very permissive to the Chinese Communist Party. It was sold under the framework of the Cold War that we needed to lean to one side to contain and undermine a more important threat at the time. But that sort of inertia of that policy long outlived the justification for it at that time. And we sort of stopped tracking what some of the consequences were of these policies, what maybe some of the changing nature of capabilities were. And so we end up with sort of several administrations from Nixon up till Trump who had, broadly speaking, the same general approach, a little tinkering here or there and some kind of burps and tickles along the way that were different. Some of them shouldn't be minimized as those kinds of things like the Tiananmen Square massacre. But even with those shocks, the broad strokes of engagement that the more we integrate China into the so-called international system, the more wealth we encourage pouring into China, the more technology we allow transferred, the more dependent we become upon China as the world's manufacturing platform. Today, people can't even conceive of a world where China isn't sort of the primary source for everything that's on the shelves and in our smart devices and in our all parts of our life. And it's almost crazy to the younger generation to realize that some of us were old enough to grow up when we weren't selling all of our soybeans to China, when we weren't buying all of our cheap goods and even some of our expensive goods from China. And they certainly can't understand how there was a time when we didn't depend on this hostile government for a vast majority of our pharmaceuticals and other kind of critical needs. And so we made this problem. And in my assessment, the sin wasn't giving the bet a try, although we can debate that. And I was of the school that was sort of mugged by reality along the way, gave it a try and said, whoa, no, you have to accept what the returns are. The sin is refusing to measure results and adjust course based on an honest review of what's happening. But I presume, and you can fill us in now, that when you entered that project on the Trump administration's approach to China policy, that all of this preamble was baked in, that there was a sense upon the campaign of 2015 and 2016 that a different approach to China was on offer. And then as the Trump administration was inaugurated, at a minimum, with a focus on trade policy, there was going to be a break with the past. How big, small, successful, unsuccessful, at the outset, one could never know. But I presume that's kind of the lead in to your project working on that. And then you focused on what some of the adjustments were and how they went through the administration. But bring us through the Cliff Notes version of what that journey was on what the key adjustments were that you assessed, how they moved forward. And then after we play with that a little bit, we'll turn to what was continuity versus change in the Biden administration.
Yeah, so it's a hugely important point that you make. It's sort of accepted now as a conventional wisdom that what was tried failed from the perspective of U.S. national interest. And one thing that is remarkable is sort of the arc of this project that I took on, or the premise of it up front, was that the Trump administration's perhaps greatest contribution in national security and foreign policy, and by the way, President Trump, when I interviewed him about this, I think probably begged to differ, which is kind of funny in and of itself. But I felt that breaking with the status quo of integration and engagement and appeasement, which effectively was aiding, abetting, and enabling the rise of our worst adversary, in contrast with the Soviet Union, which we kind of isolated and alienated, the entire Chinese strategy, which was brilliant, was to open themselves up to the West because, as you noted, we would supply the capital, the knowledge, the know-how, the technology. The greatest influence operation you could ever engage in would be to have massively expanded trade with the power you ultimately wish to dominate. And, oh, by the way, control all the most strategically significant supply chains so that you can break them over those supply chains if need be, as they threatened during the Chinese coronavirus, of course. I think the translation was plunge us into the mighty sea of coronavirus or something to that effect. And, of course, going back to the Wuhan labs, and one of the reasons I have speculated that we have not gotten to the bottom of, let's follow the money flows, let's follow the scientists, let's follow the activities that we're engaged in to figure out exactly how this strain was created and then broke out, is we are obviously to some extent culpable in it, to the extent you can trace public funding, federal funding to the activities in that Wuhan lab. And that is a perfect illustration of just how disastrous ultimately this intertwined relationship has been for us. And you see how it's compromised us by not even being willing and able to have a forthright conversation about it, an investigation into the bottom of it. But, kind of my grounding in this was, yes, that bet was made, to your point. And going back to the very beginning, it was business in particular that was the key lobby. Now, Nixon, of course, had all manner of strategic reasons why he believed it was imperative to kind of welcome China into the fold of nations. But even he noted, I believe, just after Tiananmen, that we may have created a Frankenstein's monster, was the quote. And as well, even Kissinger, when I went back and looked at some of the old NSC files and the documents, he noted that we need to make the bet on China now to break them off from Russia. But down the road, we may well need to break from China. So they were even anticipating this in the decades leading up to where we are today, where you have not a peer, but close to a near peer power in many respects. They recognized it. As you noted, and as I've written before, Tiananmen was barely a speed bump. And one other metric or one other kind of way to look at the consistency administration by administration from, not just Nixon to Clinton, but Carter and Reagan and beyond is look to the national security strategies, which I did. I went back and looked at every national security strategy under every administration, Nixon onward. And the language is remarkably consistent. Essentially, pay lip service to the idea that we'd really love China to, tamp down on its human rights violations and the like, and we're going to hold their feet to the fire. However, it's imperative that we engage in trade and we help them modernize. And essentially that the argument was made, it's in America's national interest to make China great. And it may not have been phrased exactly like that, but it was pretty darn well close. And obviously we achieved that objective to our own detriment. So I had that kind of historical framework, and a big part of my writing was first, how did the smartest guys in the room get this all wrong? And you can make that argument about splitting China from the Soviet Union early on, but you clearly couldn't as the decades advanced. And then I moved into Trump as a break from it. And Trump was really very consistent in his rhetoric and his views on China, on trade, on the imperative for America to have a serious manufacturing and industrial capacity, really dating back to at least 2000 and probably before, if you look at his public remarks. And that resonated on the campaign trail in 2015 to 2016. If you speak to folks involved in the campaign, and I'm sure you probably witnessed this as well at rallies, the China lines were some of the most popular lines. They resonated in the very communities hollowed out by no small part due to the policies, the economic policies that we pursued, and then hit with a double whammy in terms of the massive influx of fentanyl, illegal fentanyl largely being produced and exported by communist China. And so I felt that there was a massive opportunity under Trump to break from the foreign policy establishment, which, as you noted, has inculcated so many people in essentially a China-first American policy under the guise of being in America's national interest. He represented an opportunity to break from it. And in many fundamental ways, he did break from it. And so the kind of contrarian take of my project was, this is his greatest achievement because China is the greatest foe that we face, and it's going to be the greatest foe that we face for decades to come. And this was the first person to say it and begin to reorient the ship of state in the direction of America's national interest in what I felt would be something of a Gene Kirkpatrickian kind of fashion. And one of the points that I've made repeatedly about the disaster of Russiagate, and there are many disasters associated with Russiagate, is that that's so greatly diverted from the ability to pursue that agenda to the fullest extent. And now there was a great acceleration, I think, in that agenda, particularly in the last year of the administration, in no small part as a response to China's malign exploitation of the coronavirus in every single respect. But the administration first forthrightly put out there that engagement and integration was a failure in its national security strategy. That's a landmark statement to begin with. And then it set about crafting a vision for the American people of what a free and independent Indo-Pacific and America would look like vis-a-vis communist China, and pursue our independence and to some extent decouple in as many ways as we could, plus deal with the multifaceted assault that China has taken on us, taking advantage of our freedom to try and push back in a whole slew of forums. And that's, in CFIUS, that's in tariffs, that's in putting, even just capturing the nature and extent of intellectual property theft and currency manipulation, calling out the fentanyl attack a new opium war, one might argue, and in a whole slew of other ways, making clear to the American people the size, scope, and the nature of the threat, the failures that have led us to this point, and then how we ought to go about combating them. And obviously, how we go about combating them is going to require a generational commitment, a commitment in a whole slew of areas, a commitment which in some ways may run afoul of our free market principles or what we would call liberal kind of policies. But we don't have a liberal country, period, full stop, if China is the dominant world power. We are not a free and independent country if China is not if China is the dominant world power. And so I've argued that I take a very classical liberal view in many issues. I've read my Mises and Hayek and Rothbard and the like. And in an ideal world where everyone is a peaceful power and we all just want to engage towards the most economically efficient ends, then sure, of course, truly free and liberal and open trade is the way to go. But we have to prioritize in a dangerous world of adversaries where we already had unfree trade to begin with, and use every single lever of power possible to get to a place where we can be free and independent and prosperous without being reliant on our worst adversary for the basic necessities of life. And I think the Trump administration started to get towards a decoupling in rhetoric. Certainly, the president said, prepare for decoupling. We know that there was a push to jettison China from our capital markets. The Biden administration, it looks like, to a limited extent, is going to try to continue with that sort of regime, potentially through executive action. But we do not have the booting of, I think it's around $2 trillion in market capitalization of Chinese companies from our capital markets. There are obviously a whole slew of ways in which they've taken advantage of our educational and research institution openness. Obviously, the ability to buy our farmland, something that you focused on, which is a huge strategic problem for us. Of course, they can use shell companies to hide their activities. They can buy products that might be on export blacklist via third parties and find all sorts of ways around the limitations we put in place. But the first thing is recognize the size, scope, and nature of the problem, and then figure out what you can do to defend yourself from that threat and also deter that threat. Yeah. And in a whole slew of ways, I think the Trump administration started to move in that direction. Obviously, of course, in a military buildup as well. And that has redounded to the benefit of our country, including under a Biden administration, which has tried to backslide, not being able to backslide to the fullest extent that it might otherwise. Although, as I warned from the start, I don't think you could have a greater contrast in terms of someone who, for their 50 years in Washington, D.C., has been a China first, make China strong, its international interest, from very senior perches, not only managing the China portfolio, so-called, as vice president, but then also as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years as well. And Joe Biden, at every single turn, with the exception of maybe on weapon sales and the like, call it in the late 90s, early 2000s, has pretty much always been there in terms of building up and strengthening communist China. And when you add on his family's influence peddling tied to a whole slew of Chinese Communist Party linked individuals and entities, the question that I've always posed, and it's rhetorical, but it's also never been answered, is, Mr. President, to what extent do your family's dealings with communist China or Russia or Ukraine or a whole slew of other powers impact and potentially compromise our policy? And that question, he shrugs it off every single time. But it is the most important question because it is a question that implicates essentially the entire policy with respect to China. And you can't, in other words, sever then the response to a spy balloon that traverses the entirety of the United States from those ties.
Yeah. Well, it's the irony of the family relationship and influence is that President Biden's colleagues in the Senate and in his party for years and years would criticize the Bush family for the very same things. So it's a little bit of privilege on one part of politics to be able to do these kinds of things. But in the arc of this change of going from the bet and integration and all of that, to me, one of the biggest inflection points was not the reality of the Communist Party of China infiltrating a lot of parts of American life. That had been happening all along. But the sort of, in Buddhism, they'll talk about a sudden enlightenment kind of thing. And we seem to have one of those aha moments of, holy moly, they're here and they're exercising unrighteous domain in different sectors, but it's so big, I don't even know where to start. And we're so intertwined. How do we untie this knot? And since it's so hard, we're just going to put it off and buy time. And buying time essentially was the hangover from the bet. The buying time and modernizing and integrating meant that you didn't have to do anything. They would evolve. This peaceful evolution meant that they would grow out of their problems, and our opportunities to cooperate would expand, and the areas of friction would marginalize as everyone shared the wealth and opportunity, and we're all vested in the same big one world order. And so that change, though, was the domestication of China policy. So when you look at the 2016 campaign, and in both major parties' conventions, there were the anti-TPP, anti-Trans-Pacific Partnership signs. And that was the first time I can remember where both parties had a major public policy advocacy movement related to trade. And it was on the side of pulling back from doctrinaire free trade on both sides. Now, it wasn't everybody in both parties, but that was a big inflection point. And I do think that the initial kind of reframing of the Trump administration was especially with Ambassador Bob Lighthizer at USTR saying we're going to use some of these tools and we have to move toward balanced trade, that you cannot have national security if you are transferring unimaginable amounts of wealth to a government that isn't just hostile to America's way of life. It's actually the enemy of the Chinese people too. But it was this domestication. And so we started talking about trade and hollowing out of manufacturing. And people began then to say, oh yeah, well, as we look at this, there are domestic policy elements of this. I remember Vice President Pence giving what was a groundbreaking speech at the time, talking about the nature of the threat from the Communist Party of China. And the biggest break was that a chunk of his speech was about malign influences within the United States. In going back multiple administrations, as you did in the national security strategies, but as we sort of watch in life and coverage, almost never was a prominent official, much less a president, vice president, or cabinet secretary, out there openly talking about malign influences within the United States. Because China was this sort of fallen back, decrepit polity and economy coming out of the Cultural Revolution. We breathed new life in, but we're the great unipower. And so it was unimaginable, and therefore no one's guard was up for all of this influence within domestic politics. In the 1990s, when there was a moment of awareness about religious persecution in China, the United Front organizations that are outreach and influence operations for the Chinese Communist Party began engaging the Bible Belt to try to discourage constituents from contacting their members to say vote against most favored nation trade status, impose sanctions on China for these human rights abuses, stop organizing among your church followers. You don't need to smuggle any more Bibles in. We've got closets full of Bibles over here to show you. There was this massive operation, but it was all within that space. But it was the 2016 to 2017 transition when I think there was at least a moment of awareness across a part of our political spectrum that said, wow, I didn't ever imagine there was going to be an elected Republican who was going to take up the forgotten man in reality, who was not going to take up the shuttered plants, the broken down towns. There was not going to be an elected Republican that was going to say, you know what, we're going to manufacture here at home, or we're going to pose tariffs on people who engage in unfair trade. And it was also groundbreaking for a president to hit some of our allies with the need to rebalance with us and to start asking tough questions about their dependencies and ties. Over the Trump years, there was a focus on technology and communications. There was an effort to identify clean semiconductor and clean 5G supply chain pathways. And so I think in your analysis of that would resonate with what my observations were at the time. There were a lot of really promising beginnings. And I think that there were some initial successes in making this reframing work. But we, for better or for worse, we ended up with an incomplete transition because of distractions about the Russiagate and impeachment. We lost time because of coronavirus. And so we had the beginnings of this turn. Then let's talk a little bit about there were some strides made we've talked about in the Trump administration, recognizing the domestic challenges that the Communist Party of China posed in the United States. You'd mentioned earlier, too, about the Department of Justice launching its China initiative that was meant to focus on protecting against some of those malign influences. We had an adjustment on trade. We had this look at malign influences through the Department of Justice, especially in the final year of the Trump administration. We had the COVID shock, but really, maybe because of that or coincident with it, we had almost every major department of the Trump administration issuing a major report or a major move on China policy. We had the Department of Justice issuing a report about the threat that China poses in a comprehensive way. The Pentagon has always had annual requirements courtesy of Congress. But the State Department made some interesting moves, with Secretary Pompeo recognizing the genocide committed against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. He spoke often about the malign influences of the Chinese Communist Party. He had taken some moves to normalize processes and ways of talking about Taiwan. So there had been somewhat, and in Homeland Security, lest I forget, Secretary Chad Wolf issued what I believe is the first ever comprehensive report on the threat that the Communist Party of China presented to the American homeland, again, resonating with some of the points you raised about fentanyl, our academic institutions, embedding into our markets and other elements of American culture. And so by the end of the Trump 4 years, I think both sides of diagnosis and prescription had made significant strides toward this reset away from the establishment bet of the half century before. And then we come to the transition to the Biden administration. Now, I had the joy of serving briefly as president of Radio Free Asia, and in its infinite wisdom, the Biden transition saw fit within an hour of the inauguration to terminate my employment. It wasn't exactly what you would call legal, but there was no point in fighting it at that time. But there clearly was an effort by elements of the Biden administration to eliminate everything that had the scarlet T on it. Anything that was a Trump policy had to be scrubbed and something wildly different. Wokeism seemed to find its way in many different forms. Pull back on the China initiative at the Justice Department. But the part that seemed to run somewhat on autopilot, but with less vigor, is the economic relationship. And probably because there's a constituency in both major parties that valued that move. And maybe that reality has held it in place. We didn't in the Trump administration years have wars and rumors of wars that we were getting deeply involved in, but President Trump did strike when necessary to have a demonstration effect and to bolster deterrence. And so during those years, we had unusual diplomacy to mitigate the threat of North Korea. We had the chiding of Europe prophetically to try to step up and take care of its own. So there was a perception, contrary to the mainstream argument in the United States, that American strength was real. We had an economic revival. We had energy independence. We had flexibility to try a dramatic, different approach in the Middle East, the area that you had studied intensively post 9/11. And so that was all relevant to the context in which China policy was happening. If you're moving in positions of strength and progress in all those other areas, your options for managing China are far better. And I think we have this uncomfortable coincidence of strongman Xi Jinping hitting his stride as a weak presidency comes into office and begins to erode some of that credibility around the world. The perceptions of what one can get away with in the United States. Americans, we would like to believe, were quite salty about what happened with COVID, but that got very politicized. They don't necessarily directly associate that with China because our politics made it almost entirely domestic. But at some level, Americans know something was wrong, that they lied, they manipulated the world, they manipulated us, they exported their lockdown policies, and we all paid dearly for it. But talk a little bit from your perch, having watched this Trump era transformation come into the current era. Agree or disagree with my diagnosis on why and how some of these things were changing. But what say you about where we are today on China policy? Because we don't have entirely the policy of the warm bath of conventional thinking of the past. But we also don't have the energy and the direction of the stated Trump goals, especially as they were, I think, amplified in the final year of the Trump administration. So what say you about where we are? How do we even define or talk about this?
Well, a couple measures I would note as a consequence of that litany of policies that you laid out. All manner of senior Trump administration officials were sanctioned by China at the very end of the Trump administration. Would you say the same if the Biden administration were to end tomorrow? I think not.
Your point.
Another measure is you have generals now who are talking about preparing for an invasion of Taiwan and potentially war with China before 2030. And I take these dates and these projections with a real grain of salt because we've proven so off so many times with our estimates as to China's capability and its will. Now, granted, China has not engaged in a serious shooting war in decades. So we don't know, until kind of the old Mike Tyson adage, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. We don't know how it actually would play out. And also, would any sort of kinetic action that China takes actually look like a traditional shooting war like we've seen in the past, especially when you know that probably the first thing China would attempt to do would be to create all manner of diversions, knockout communications, sabotage in a whole slew of ways to divert us from whatever its primary objective would be. But nevertheless, you have looming ominously these various threats that are being talked about openly. One thing that resonated with me when I spoke with President Trump, and he's talked about this publicly now, he had not at the time, was that, it's been reported that Trump really didn't care about Taiwan and the like, but Trump, as he explained it to me, and I think as he's elucidated publicly, made it very clear he did not want Taiwan being invaded, and that if Taiwan were to be invaded, there would be cataclysmic hell to pay, and that he communicated this directly to Xi Jinping. I don't think that deterrence exists today, and to that extent, it's kind of in some ways, humbling and also terrifying thing to consider, but I do think one man can serve as a pillar of deterrence, really. And when the leader of the free world does not project that power, and who knows if Biden would even consider himself the leader of the free world or more of the woke world at this point, or if the free world isn't worth defending as we would define it, that has serious consequences, all manner of consequences. Look, just in terms of military projections, China's testing of a hypersonic missile, would that have happened on President Trump's watch? And why were we so taken aback and surprised, at least according to all public comments, that China had that capability. Very disturbing. So heading to that, these balloon incursions where the administration says, well, it's not a big deal, but also, yeah, they do have spy capabilities. And also, there hasn't really been an alarming increase in these sorts of incursions. Okay, so does that mean that we've had a whole slew of incursions in our airspace now for weeks, months, years? And then did we not detect them, as some administration officials seemed to leak during the Trump years? What does that say about our capabilities? Or were subordinates not reporting up the chain? I mean, there are all a whole manner of questions wrapped up in the balloon issue. And I know people have rightly noted that, yes, balloon surveillance is a massive breach and potentially threatens our nuclear sites and other sensitive military facilities. But at the same time, we have devices in our pockets that are the ultimate spy devices. Both things can be true. The fact that China feels it can act with impunity and threaten us in the way that it does, and that a president doesn't want to scuttle a meeting between Xi Jinping and Secretary Blinken that's going to accomplish nothing, most likely, except probably us giving away the store in some form or fashion. The fact that the administration, I forget the exact quote, but originally, and this has been pretty consistent, has talked about, we want to cooperate in certain areas, compete in other areas, and I think there's one or two more C's in there. They've just made such a hash of it because they won't forthrightly admit that China is the greatest adversary we face, and we need to do every possible thing that we can to harden ourselves against it, to strengthen ourselves as a deterrent, to find allies and partners around the world to shoulder the burden so that we're not overextending ourselves. And oh, by the way, in relation to that, obviously our massive and open-ended commitment to the Ukraine has real consequences with respect to China because of the blood and treasure and weaponry that we are devoting to that cause. And we can obviously debate about that, and we'll have vigorous debates about it, I'm sure, going into 2024. China, of course, I'm sure, is observing with a keen eye our operations there, what kind of intelligence we're providing, our capabilities, how far we're willing to go to combat the Russians. And of course, Russia is the junior partner to China, the senior partner, in a relationship that has only further blossomed. And going back to what I said at the outset, I long believed that Trump himself wanted to effectuate a new Sino-Soviet split. It doesn't mean being soft on Russia, because the Trump administration's policies were frankly infinitely tougher on Russia than the Obama-Biden administration's policies were. And Biden, going back years, and the Democrat Party going back years, quite frankly, always wanted to cultivate a positive relationship.
They were the authors of détente.
And right, exactly. But we had an opportunity, I think, under Trump to have a peace through strength with Russia, and maybe, even though they would try to cheat and undermine, maybe peel them off and keep them at some distance, or at least create dissension between them and China. And instead, now you have an axis between Russia, China, and Iran, where, of course, the Biden administration, in various ways, is propping up the Iranian regime, and in other ways, kowtowing to the Chinese regime. That is as close as it's been. And we can debate if it's as strong as each of these individual powers have been, but certainly collectively, I don't think they've ever been as unified as they've been, all on the Biden administration's watch. And I think the whole Trump strategy was make America as strong as it could possibly be, get other countries to do their fair share so that we don't have to police the world, and then focus all of our resources on prioritizing the greatest threats, use overwhelming force in very limited situations as a signal that you better not mess with us, which is, a page out of the Reagan playbook and the Kirkpatrick playbook. And instead, we have a country that is demoralized, trending in the wrong way in so many different metrics. A China which, though wounded perhaps relative to where it was as a consequence of some of the economic struggles they faced, and I think the more totalitarian and ruthless the regime acts, presumably, perhaps, the more shaky the ground it's standing on is. Maybe that's an opportunity for us. But we've potentially squandered an opportunity here to really not put a nail in the CCP's coffin, perhaps, but to grow the gap in capabilities between our two powers. And I think that's being squandered under Biden. And I hope very seriously that going into 2024, China is a primary issue. I suspect there's going to be a whole slew of other issues that take center stage, but the China issue is relevant in a whole slew of other domestic areas, as you noted, and it ought to be a central part of the debates to come.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Ben. Ben Weingarten can be found at RealClearInvestigations and the Federalist and a whole host of other places. It's been a pleasure talking. We covered things around the world, things domestic, the history of China policy. Really, what better use of an hour could anyone really have? But thank you for joining, Ben. I'm Steve Yates, chair of the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. This is the China Desk podcast, hosted by Federal Newswire. Thank you for joining. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.